1 Peter 3 contains the most difficult verse in the whole Bible. Let's read it. Chapter 3, verse 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah. What in the world is going on in these verses? There are a few questions we have to wrestle with in this passage. First, to whom did Christ preach? Who are these spirits in prison? And then, what was the content of his preaching? What did he proclaim? What did he say? And then thirdly, when did Christ preach and where? As you can probably guess, everyone has an opinion on this text. But there are primarily two different options. So option number one, Jesus is going to descend into hell between his death and resurrection and preach a message of condemnation and victory over fallen angels, demons who sinned in the days of Noah. If you'd like a copy of this chart, which lays out all the evidence for the two main views of this text, you can download it for free by following the link in the description below. All right, let's follow the evidence for option number one first. Who were these angels who sinned in the days of Noah? I bet you're thinking of Genesis chapter 6, and you're right. According to this interpretation, the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 are fallen angels who bore children with the daughters of men. And it seems like Peter and Jude are possibly referring to the same event when they write that the angels left their proper dwelling and pursued unnatural desire, just as Sodom and Gomorrah pursued a different kind of unnatural desire. And get this, God does not spare these angels in 2 Peter 2, but casts them into hell and commits them to chains of gloomy darkness, eternal chains. Now I wonder, could these be prison chains perhaps? If so, and Jesus really did descend into hell as the Apostles' Creed teaches, what did Jesus proclaim to these fallen angels in prison there in hell? Well, the typical answer is something like condemnation or victory over these fallen angels. I win, said Jesus. And this does seem to fit the context, potentially, where just 2 verses later, after 3:18 through 20, look what we read in verse 22. Jesus went into heaven, sat down at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. So, Peter is writing to a persecuted church, and he is telling them in verse 14, have no fear of your persecutors. Why? Because Jesus said, I have already defeated angels and proclaimed victory over them. The second interpretive option is radically different. It proposes that Jesus didn't preach to demons, but to humans, and that Jesus didn't preach in hell between his death and resurrection, but on earth, back in the days of Noah. So how does this work? First off, Jesus isn't the one speaking. Noah is, and Jesus is simply speaking through Noah, and he's doing so in the Spirit. Look at this. 1 Peter 3:18, Jesus was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit. And while he's in the Spirit, he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison. So how did he proclaim to them? Well, he did so in the Spirit. In the same way, perhaps, as Jesus spoke through the prophets in the Spirit. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1. Verse 10, it says, concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about this grace inquired what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ. So it was the Spirit of Christ in the prophets which predicted the sufferings of Christ. Could it be that the same Spirit of Christ which spoke through the prophets spoke through Noah back in Genesis chapter 6. Now this would be strange because Noah did not speak once in the entire flood account in Genesis 6 through 8. However, despite this fact, in 2 Peter, the same author, Peter is going to say, he's going to call Noah a herald of righteousness. Peter calls Noah a herald of righteousness, and this word herald, it's the noun form of the verb for proclaim. Who then did Noah / the Spirit of Christ preach to? Who were these spirits in prison who formerly did not obey? Well, the phrase "in the days of Noah" and "while the ark was being prepared" is important. You see, it took Noah 100, maybe 120 years to build the ark. And in that time, he probably acquired quite an audience. But he wasn't surrounded by spirits in prison, but rather formerly disobedient humans who were washed away in the flood. So why then does Peter call them spirits in prison? Well, from Peter's perspective, they are spirits in prison now, though they were simply formerly disobedient humans back in the days of Noah, when Noah, the herald of righteousness, preached to them. It would be like saying President Lincoln practiced law in Springfield, Illinois. Now, Lincoln didn't work as a lawyer while he was president, but we can still use the title or the label of president to refer to an earlier period in his life. Peter is going to do the same thing in the very next chapter. So our tough passage is here in chapter 3, but in chapter 4, he says that this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead. In other words, he's saying that the gospel was preached to people who have since died, but now are alive in the spirit up in heaven. And Noah, as a preacher, seems to fit the context of 1 Peter as well. This is a letter that is all about persecution and suffering. And Peter just called on this persecuted church to always be ready to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the hope that you have. That's 1 Peter 3:15. In 3:18, Jesus is going to speak through Noah, who was probably asked quite a lot of questions. Now, by the way, this diagram comes from a course I taught through the general epistles. If you want to check out a free course with resources like this, click the link in the description below. Do you think Noah ever had to make a defense during the 100 years he spent building that boat? And so too, Peter's audience, who likewise were a persecuted minority in a hostile world, are called upon to make a defense. So, what do you think? Which interpretation do you like? Did Jesus preach to demons in hell? Or did Jesus preach through Noah while he built the ark? Go ahead, leave a comment below. Which interpretation makes most sense to you? Now, another passage that's difficult to interpret is in Exodus 40, where Moses was forbidden from entering the tabernacle. That's kind of strange. Want to know what's going on there? Check out this next video.